Okay, what would you say is the biggest problem with these two sentences here? The biggest problem with this is that it doesn't make any sense. It's totally unclear. What is it talking about? In its positivity, what is that? In its positivity? What is it in its positivity? What is that? The topic of this video is how to write a philosophy paper. You're going to need to know how to write a philosophy paper if you're enrolled in this course with me, an online course where there's philosophical essays or writing involved, or you're going to need to know how to do this if you're enrolled in any philosophy course, because the kind of writing that you have to do when you're doing philosophy is noticeably different from the kind of writing that you have to do in other college courses. So let's start with some steps. Step 1. You should actually learn the material that the paper is going to be about. So if you're enrolled in a class and it's time to submit an essay or a paper on some of the material that you've been reading, you may have only read part of the material, or you may have read it all and you listened to the lecture and you understood most of it, sort of, and you think, okay, it's time to sit down and write the paper. No, it's not time to sit down and write the paper. Spend more of your time and energy learning the material beforehand. It will make the writing way, way, way easier. Okay, that's the most important step. It almost always gets left out. Spend a lot of your time and energy actually learning the material, and even if that means spending less time and less energy on the paper will still be better. Step 2, read the paper prompt or the assignment very carefully. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of paper prompts in philosophy classes. There are the rather specific ones, and then there are the open-ended general ones. If it's an open-ended prompt, if you're just being asked to write a paper about something, then you're writing what we could call a kind of standard philosophy paper. We'll get to that in a bit. First, let's talk about the case where there's a rather specific question that you're asked to answer in the paper, or a prompt that you're supposed to respond to, or something like that. If you are given a specific prompt, then you should do exactly what the prompt says. And you should read the prompt with a degree of care and concern that you don't normally bring to most of the things that you read in your life. For example, if the prompt says, or the assignment says, that you should attack an argument for a certain position, then you should only attack that argument. You shouldn't attack the position itself. There's a difference, of course, between a claim or a position or a view and an argument in favor of that view. If you want an explanation of the difference between these two things, I have another video about that I've either already made or that I'm planning on making, and if I've already made it, then I'll link to it somewhere. The point is just, you should read the assignment extremely carefully and do exactly what it says, not something in the generic neighborhood. To illustrate this point, here's an email, a real email that I really received when I was in college from an astronomy professor. Here's the email. Okay, so this is the email that I received on April 11th, 2007, at 8:45 in the morning, from a professor who we will call J.M. Pasikoff, because that is his real name. I was in Astronomy 104 in 2007, and the email reads as follows. There's no greeting at the beginning of the email. I have marked up the quiz's first 2 questions. They should be in your mailboxes. Back at the time, we, submitted quizzes by hand, and then they got given back to us by being put into our student mailboxes. It is worth mentioning that many people did not answer the questions asked. For example, to make an analogy, say the question is, how do you get to Jessup Hall? Jessup Hall was a building on the campus where I went to college. I got lots of answers equivalent to, you can walk around, Sometimes you turn. Jessup was built in 1920, and it has dormer windows. It has computer stuff inside. Those pieces of information are either vague or irrelevant. The answer I would want from the mailboxes, he's referring to the mailboxes in front of the astronomy building. The answer I would want from the mailboxes is, go down the front stairs, turn right, and go to the building just ahead and to your left. The email actually continued for a little bit in the same sort of snarky way. Anyway, and then it was signed Professor Pasikoff. So as snarky as this email is, it makes its point pretty clearly. The point is, if you're asking for directions on how to get someplace, you don't just give random other information about that place. You say how to get there. That is very frequently the problem that a lot of students run into when they're given a specific prompt. If you're asked to present, for example, a counterexample to a certain claim, then what you should do is you shouldn't give some other type of argument against that claim. You shouldn't explain and argue for the opposite of that claim. No. You just take the general claim and you present a counterexample to it. Now, in order to do that, you will have to know exactly what a counterexample is. And counterexample is a technical philosophical term in a certain sense. And if you don't know what it is, and you get a paper prompt that tells you to give a counterexample, then you should just admit that you don't know what it is and ask someone to explain it to you. That's the only way. Or else you're going to be wandering around in circles mentioning when the building was built and whether it has computer stuff inside. Okay, so we get that point about if it's a specific paper prompt, then what you want to do is read the prompt very, very carefully and do exactly what it says. What if, however, you are given a very open-ended prompt? You're just basically asked to write a paper about something that's been covered in the course, something specific or something of your own choosing. What do? Well, in that case, you have to write what I'll call a standard philosophy paper. A standard philosophy paper is, well, just a paper that makes a somewhat interesting philosophical claim. It can be small. It can be a very limited claim. You're making a philosophical claim, and you are arguing that that claim is true. You're trying to rationally persuade your reader that that claim is true. That's what the paper does. It's a kind of, well, persuasive essay. Here, let's write that out. So if you're writing a standard philosophy paper, you need a thesis, a claim, a somewhat original, mildly interesting claim, and then you need an argument in favor of that claim. You need reasons or considerations or things that you could say that would persuade someone, if they were being perfectly rational and if they understood everything you said very clearly, to adopt your claim, to believe that your claim is true. That's really all you need. You might also need some background material. You might also need to explain some of the, philosophical writing that you've been covering in the course. If that's the case, if you need background material in there, then it goes in between. You first have your thesis, then whatever background facts you need, and then you have your argument. The argument also does not need to, although it can be, it does not need to be laid out in premise, conclusion form. You don't have to, enumerate the premises in an argument. It can sort of be a free-flowing argument written in prose. That's the typical way that philosophy papers are written anyway. But it should be, things other than the thesis. Don't just repeat the thesis over and over again in different ways. Things other than the thesis that are meant to show that the thesis is true, whatever that thesis is, whatever that original philosophical claim is. And now for the third and final step. Step 3. Write the paper. That's the third step. It is, of course, the hardest step, and we're going to spend the whole rest of this video talking about it. The main thing that you want to focus on in an undergraduate course, without question, what you want to spend almost all of your time and energy doing is trying to make the paper clear. You want to make it clear in a way that your other writing isn't, and that all the writing that you read in the newspaper isn't clear. You want to make it clearer than anything you've ever written. Clarity, that's what you're focusing on. This is where 90% of your energy in step 3 should be going. Okay, so the question is, how do you make a paper clear? Well, here is some advice. Okay, first tip, hand in the smartest person's paper. Here's what I mean by that. You're going to have to write several drafts, right? And each time you write those drafts, your understanding of the material, your understanding of what it is that you want to say is going to become clearer in your mind. And then, only after you've understood what's going on, do you type up the material that's going to be handed in. Here's what happens a lot of the time. A student reads through the material for the course, right? They read through the question that they're supposed to write about, and then they sit down and they write a paper. And at the beginning of the paper, they're sort of figuring out what their ideas are, and they're clarifying to themselves what they want to say. And then, as an instructor, you get to the end of this paper that you're reading, and the end is super clear. It's very clear what's going on, what claims the student or the author is trying to make. And that's because, well, by the end of the paper, the author knows what they want to say. If this is happening to you, you can't hand in those early paragraphs. Those first paragraphs, they are poison. They were written by someone who didn't know what they wanted to say, so you can't hand them in. You write a draft of the paper. By the end of the draft, you figured out really what it is that you want to say. You need to throw out those early paragraphs and write them again. Let me put it this way. If you had a friend who was not quite as smart as you and didn't understand the material as well and wasn't as good of a writer as you are, would you allow them to write your paper for you and hand it in? No, because it wouldn't get as good a grade. It wouldn't be as good a paper. It was written by your less intelligent friend. Well, when you sat down to write those first few paragraphs before having clarified to yourself what it is that you want to say, you, back then, were your less intelligent friend. Don't hand in the work of someone who didn't understand the material as well as you now understand it. So by the time you get to the end of that draft and you really understand what you want to say, erase everything and then write a new clean draft. And that paper will have been written by the smartest version of you. And that's the one you want to hand in. Step 2, use simple language. Don't try to sound smart. Don't try to use big words that you don't know how to use. Just use the simplest language possible. This is like when my father tries to say, "Oh, I'm going to text you an email message." No, Dad, you can't text an email. You can text a text. You can send an email, but you can't text an email. See, he doesn't really know how to use these specialized terms. If you don't know how to use a specialized philosophical term, don't use it. Just write in the simplest way possible. Say exactly what you mean, not something else. You want to be as precise as possible. If you mean to say, for example, that the soul is an immaterial object, then just say that. The soul is an immaterial object. Don't say something different like the soul does not have a material presence. What does that mean? Is that exactly the same? That seems like a slightly different claim. If it's a slightly different claim, don't use it. Use exactly the one that you have in mind. Let me give some examples to illustrate, well, at least these, the second and third point here. Here is a sentence that might appear in an undergraduate philosophy paper. Okay, let's read this. In its positivity, mentation, or the psychological inner, moves not just what is already within its sphere, but also that without. Subjectivity itself supports footprints, biological, chemical. Okay, what would you say is the biggest problem with these two sentences here? When I teach this, this class on how to write a philosophy paper, when I teach it live to a group of students, I ask this question, and then the students say what they think is the biggest problem with these two sentences. And I get all sorts of answers. What do you think? Write down an answer. I mean, commit yourself to something. I'll tell you what I think it is. The biggest problem with this is that it doesn't make any sense. It's totally unclear. What is it talking about? In its positivity, what is that? In its positivity? What is it in its positivity? What is mentation or the psychological inner? What are these things? Moves not just what is already within its sphere. Its sphere, what is its, but also that without. What does this mean? The problem with these sentences is that you read them, and even if you've, been in the course that's about this material, sort of, or whatever, you have no idea what it's saying. That's the problem. Here is my attempt to rewrite this same set of ideas, or the ideas that maybe are behind these two sentences, in a clearer way. Mental states can cause other mental states. For example, smelling laundry detergent can remind one of one's grandmother. But mental states can also cause non-mental physical events. For example, thirst can cause me to walk toward water. Okay, way clearer, right? This we understand. Mental states can cause other mental states. For example, whoa, now we're getting an example, right? Smelling laundry detergent, that's one mental state. The mental state of having a certain smell sensation, right? It can remind one of one's grandmother. That's another mental state. A memory of one's grandmother, right? So that's a mental state causing another mental state. Great. But mental states can also cause non-mental physical events. For example, thirst, that's a mental state, right? The sensation of feeling thirst can cause me to walk toward water. Walking is a non-mental physical event. Boom. Let's say a few more things about what's great about this. First off, the sentences are shorter. Mental states can cause other mental states. End of sentence. That's it. Say what you want to say and get out of the sentence. Short sentences are clearer. Also, this has examples. Examples that illustrate the more abstract points that are being made. There's a somewhat abstract point, and then there's an example. There's another somewhat abstract point, and then there's another example. Much clearer. Also, as we just saw, there's a kind of parallel structure. The abstract statement, the example, the next abstract statement, the next example, right? When the structure is parallel in this way, or in just any other way, when the structure is simple, it becomes obvious to the reader. And if the reader can understand the structure of what's being written, oh, I'm getting a claim and I'm getting an example that illustrates that claim, then the reader can understand what's going on. So transparent structure, that's another great thing about this. And then the final thing is that the words or language, it's just much simpler. I mean, in this case, the largest word in here is detergent. If detergent is the biggest word you've got in your philosophy paper, you're doing it right. Okay, let's go through one more example. Okay, what have we got? Benthamite philosophical morality is of the afterword of agents' movements, heinous killing again and again, in all the cases, situations, and circumstances of death and dying. Lest the effects be pleasant, so too the movements be efficacious. What? What is that? What does that mean? Efficacious? What is efficacious? Here is an attempt to take what I think is the thought behind this, these two sentences, and write them in a clearer way. Oh, by the way, these aren't real sentences that real students wrote. I made up these sentences to illustrate this point. According to Jeremy Bentham, the moral status of an action depends on its consequences. Consider, for example, the action of killing. Some cases of killing lead to very good consequences. In these cases, Bentham would say that killing is good. Clear as day. 4 short sentences, an example, all of the unnecessary fancy terminology gets stripped away. Just as simple language as possible, as simple structure as possible, saying exactly what you want to say and not something slightly different. So these examples were supposed to get you onto the idea of clear writing in the way that these first few tips were suggesting. So let's go through a few more. Here's another one. Repeat words. And by that I mean, if you mean the same thing at one time and at another time in the paper, then use the exact same words, the exact same phrases in both places. If, for example, you're writing about morality, and you want to talk about whether some actions are morally good or morally bad, then pick a phrase that means morally good, like morally good, and just use that phrase over and over again throughout the whole paper. Don't switch between good and right and moral and righteous and upstanding. All of those terms can kind of mean the same thing. You may have gotten this advice that I was given in high school, the advice that you should vary your word choice. When you're writing a philosophy paper, don't vary your word choice. The reason is that, well, because philosophers are using words in a way that is more careful and rigorous than we ordinarily use words, philosophers will use different terms that seem to mean the same thing, to mean very different things. They might use good to mean one thing and right to mean another. And so if you switch from one to another, from good to right, then the philosopher who's grading your paper will assume that you're using those words so carefully that you mean something different when you say right than back when you said good. And so you're going to confuse everybody. What this will do, of course, is it will make the writing more boring. It won't be exciting in the sense that you've varied up your word choice. That's okay. Give up the excitingness, give up the thrill. We're going for clarity. And here's how you get clarity. You repeat your words. I'll just say one more thing about this. It's at this step that I often get pushback from students because they've been given the exact opposite advice in the past. If you don't believe me, even after my own explanation of why you can't use different words to mean the same thing, then just Google how to write a philosophy paper and read the first 10 things that come up. They will all, I promise you, give this exact same advice. If you mean the same thing, use the same word over and over and over again. All right, tip number 5, signpost. What this means is that you should use words and phrases at the beginning of sentences, at the beginning of paragraphs, that point towards what you're doing in that sentence or what you're doing in that paragraph. So, for example, according to Jeremy Bentham, that phrase at the beginning of this sentence explains what's going on in the rest of the sentence. It's a little sign that says, hey, this sentence says what Jeremy Bentham thinks, not necessarily what I, the author of the sentence, the one who's writing this sentence in a paper, not necessarily what I think. Or consider, for example. That's another signpost. That says what we're about to get in the next sentence. It's going to be an example that illustrates, well, whatever just came before. If you're listing items, you want to number the items. Say first, second, third, fourth, fifth, like I'm doing here. One warning about this. Sometimes students will just throw in the word thus or the word therefore all over the place in a philosophy paper. If it's their first time writing a philosophy paper, these words have a rather specific meaning. They're used when the thing that you're about to say is demonstrated or proven or shown by the thing that you just said. Only use these words if you know exactly how to use them and exactly where they belong. If you're not sure, just don't use the words at all. Okay, tip number 6 for how to write clearly is this. Make it clear what thoughts are yours and what thoughts are not, right? Label everything extremely explicitly. If you're summarizing what someone else thinks, then say, according to them, or as so-and-so says, or something very simple like that that just lets everyone know that this is what they say, right? And if it's your own thought, you can label it as your own thought, right? You can say, it therefore seems that such and such. Well, that means that it therefore seems to you that such and such, right? Make it super, super clear what you think and what other people think. Okay, number 7, define your terms. If you are using a technical term, and you will be using lots of words in very specific, very precise ways. You should define them explicitly. You should say exactly what you mean by those terms. Number 8, read your paper out loud. Go alone in a room by yourself and read the thing out loud. You will catch a lot of mistakes. I write philosophy papers that get sent to academic philosophy journals, and before I submit a paper, I read it out loud. It's the only way to catch all those typos. And it works. And I know that this is a piece of advice that I'm going to say at this point, and a lot of the students are going to hear this and they're going to nod their heads, and then they're not going to do it. Because it feels silly to stand in a room alone and read something out loud. Do it anyway. It will work. Number 9, use the verb to be a lot. By the verb to be, I mean that word that sometimes appears in the form of is, or are, or was, or will be. This is all one word. It's the verb to be something. That word is one of the simplest words we've got. It's one of the simplest verbs we have in the English language. If you're doing it right, and you're saying exactly what you mean and not something else, and you're saying it in the simplest way possible, then you're probably just going to say what is the case a lot. So if you read through your paper and you see a lot of is's and are's and was's and will be's, you're doing things right. Okay, at this point, there's an objection that seems to arise. I've been emphasizing that philosophical writing has to be so clear. And I've given all of these steps or tips or something like that for making the writing so clear. But you might be thinking, all these things that we've read in this course so far, they've been really hard to understand. They haven't been clear. So why are all of the readings for this course so unclear? And all of the writing for the course, why does it have to be so clear? The answer is that actually the writing for this course has been very clear. It's just written in a sort of different language. Most of the things that we've read for this course were written not for undergraduate philosophy students, but they were written for other professional philosophers who've been doing philosophy full-time as their job for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. And philosophers, like any other group of experts, they develop a whole bunch of technical terms and jargon. And so all the things that we've been reading, they've been unclear mostly not because the writing is unclear, but because it's written sort of in a different language. If you read something in a language that you don't understand, then it's a kind of mistake to think, well, I don't understand this. It must be unclear. No, it might be very clear. It's just that you don't know the vocabulary. That's kind of what's going on with all of these philosophy papers that we've been reading. And of course, we have to read them because this is college, and in college, you read the real thing. Okay, so those are the tips that I have about how to write a clear philosophy paper. Here's a few more things that you should focus on. These don't really have anything specifically to do with writing clearly, but they will help you produce a better philosophy paper. Tip number 1 for how to write a philosophy paper that doesn't have anything to do with clarity. Use direct quotes sparingly. Is that how you spell sparingly? I don't know. Here's the thing about direct quotes. When you use a direct quote in a paper, you're just retyping the exact words that someone else wrote. And often those words actually aren't the clearest way to express that thought, or for that matter, it doesn't actually demonstrate that you understand what those words mean, just the fact that you can retype them. It's much better if it will improve the flow of the paper, it will demonstrate a greater degree of understanding on your part if you can rephrase what some other philosopher or author is saying in your own words and get it right. That's the way to do it. So try not to use so many direct quotes. They're kind of a crutch. There is one exception to this, which is that if you are writing a kind of exegetical paper, that is, if the thesis of your paper, the thing that you're arguing for, is that so-and-so thinks such and such. If you're arguing that someone thinks something, well, then the direct quotes take on a new role. They're now the evidence in your argument. You're arguing that the author thinks this, when that's a controversial claim. Others think that the author doesn't think that. The way that you argue for that is to, well, quote that author and then point out how the fact that they wrote that means that they have to think the thing that you're claiming that they think. Anyway, that's the exception. Number 2. If you don't have any ideas, talk with friends. Some philosophy papers will require you to have an original thought, to not just regurgitate the things that were in the reading or that were explained to you in lecture, but you will have to have a thought of your own and express it in the paper. But what if you don't have a thought of your own? Well, here's what you do. You find someone who owes you a favor, and you explain to them the material in the course. You give them a little lecture, maybe in 10, 15 minutes, explaining to them the ideas in the course. By explaining them to someone else, you'll clarify them to yourself, and you will then just sort of start having opinions or thoughts about them. At least, this is the best advice I have on that front. Okay, tip number 3. Don't begin your paper with anything like the following. Since the dawn of time, philosophers have wondered. Don't start with that. It's too common of a way to start. You don't know anything about the dawn of time. Don't do it. Don't start your paper with since the dawn of time, philosophers have wondered, or anything sort of like that. Webster's dictionary defines justice as so-and-so. Don't start your paper with that. We don't care about Webster's dictionary. You get to define your terms however you need to. Webster doesn't matter. Don't start with anything like that. Okay, and here are some things not to end your paper with. This is just my opinion, so who knows? Don't end your paper with that. I don't want just your opinion. I want your opinion backed up by an argument that proves that your opinion is the correct opinion. End on a strong note, none of this who knows stuff. Also, no matter what we say here, the debate will rage on. Nope, don't end the paper with that. Say what you want to say. If you've really done your job, then the debate will not rage on because you will have convinced everyone. Okay, number 5. You can use the word I. You can use personal pronouns. Don't worry about any rules like that. You can say things like, I will argue such and such. That's great. That's a great thing to write. Tell us what you're going to argue. That's fantastic. And you can mention yourself. What you don't want to do is you don't want to use as evidence in your argument the fact that you feel a certain way or you are tempted towards a certain conclusion, right? That's the kind of thing that you don't want to write. But actually just using these kinds of personal pronouns, that's fine. Go ahead, use them as much as you want. Number 6, you don't need to read other material. In most philosophy courses, for most assignments, you don't need to go find other resources. You've read difficult readings for the course already, and the paper assignment is almost certainly just about those readings that were assigned in the course. When you're writing a philosophy paper in an undergraduate course, you're typically not attempting to demonstrate your ability to cover an enormous ground of material or find lots of resources hidden away about some topic. That's not what you're trying to do. What you're trying to demonstrate, if you're trying to demonstrate anything, is that you can make an original claim and argue persuasively for it. Okay, that's it. I look forward to reading your papers. All that writing for just that one joke.